My name is Johnny. I'm an intern here at the center through OSU, and I'll be taking you through the tour today. So this is the Architects of the Massacre. It's going to be focusing on the group of men and one woman who kind of started this whole thing. Because a lot of people, even if you're a local, come through here and they only know about the massacre part, the part where black people are victims. But this exhibit focuses on the men and the woman who perpetrated all of that, because it wasn't just some racist happening. There was a reason for these things. So we started here with the governor of Oklahoma in 1917. His name is Robert Lee Williams. So 1917 is a big year for America. That's the year we enter World War I. And so Robert Lee Williams, he was very afraid that the Germans were going to invade Oklahoma. It's his biggest fear. So he created a bill that allowed counties to create within their cities things called councils of defenses. And those councils were allowed to, start funding for Liberty bonds. Liberty bonds is something that people buy to kind of help the war effort. They could also start recruitment for enlisting, things like that. But kind of under the table, I don't think, whether or not it was intentional, we don't know. It also allowed the group of people to kind of run their city like an overpowered city council, if you will. So Tulsa is a prime example of that. So we've got these people here. That was the first Tulsa Council of Defense. Each of these people, this was their day job. So this is what they did and all the things that they managed. Like Harry Tyrell was an oilman. Much of these people were, but he also started the Tulsa YMCA. So they did a lot of things that were good for the communities, but it kind of goes too far once we get into the racial elements of what's going on here with the architects. So after we get to that Council of Defense, they reconvene and they add some more men. We start with businessmen like Robert M. McFarland. Some people who are, if you're a local, you know his name. His name's on a lot of buildings and a couple of streets. They're the businessmen, like with Mr. Burr Gibbons and the very famous W. Tate Brady. These are the guys who you go to if you need them to move money. They're usually oilmen. They own the refinery, or they own the field. They own the bank. And they're all part of this council, so you can kind of see what people are doing here, what kind of people are on this council. And then we get into the newspaper, because you can't have all these people telling you what to do without a little bit of propaganda. So we start with Clarence B. Douglas, and we move into Richard Lloyd Jones and Eugene Lorton. These two men are really important from the minute they get on the council all the way down the line to the massacre. Because, it's 1917 to 1921, you're not getting push notifications for the BBC and NPR. You get 4 papers a day. And these two men are the men who print those papers. And they work for our businessmen who are back over here. So if Tate Brady or Robert McFarland tells you that, wants to tell people to bank at our new bank, or come work in these oil fields, or don't trust unions because they're communists, these guys over here in the newspaperman area, they're going to make it happen. They're going to make sure that you know exactly what they want you to know. And that's where it all really starts, though, because this city and Oklahoma really has a big history of being anti-union. Right now, Oklahoma's even a right-to-work state. You can get fired for existing at your job for no reason. And a lot of that has to do with these types of men, these men particularly, because we get into something that they perpetrated called the Tulsa Outrage. And there, at that point, we had a strong union here called the International Workers of the World, the IWW, the Wobblies for short. So the FBI is investigating them because they might be communists. It's World War I. The whole country is worried about unions being communists. They're like, hey, Tulsa City Council of Defense, don't mess with them. We're doing an investigation on them. Well, the council's not having that. So we don't know for sure how they did it, or even if it was them, but they staged a couple of bombings in the night to make it look like the men from the IWW perpetrated it. And then they wait a couple of months for investigation. And then in 1917, when we move into, I believe it was October to November, Tate Brady himself and a couple of his men who come into the IWW's headquarters at night round up 17 of these men. And what they do to these men is outrageous. They take them out of town, they put hoods on them, take them out of town, and they tar and feather them, because I guess we're still doing that. And then they tie them up for people to see, like a spectacle. Like, hey, these are union men. this is what happens if you want to be in a union. And then they run them out of town, kind of botching the whole investigation against them. So you can see where the climate is here in Tulsa at the time. Like we're willing to go over the government of the land and to do what we want, to get what we want. And that's kind of the attitude here that the Tulsa City Council of Defense perpetrates or perpetuates. And so we move into 1918, 1919. It's relatively quiet, save for what we call the last lynching here in Tulsa. It's important that we call it the last lynching because it was a young white man who got lynched. His name is Roy Belton. He was guilty. Him and his girlfriend, I believe, were guilty of murdering a taxi cab driver. But it was significant because he was white, and they called it the last lynching because they wanted to make it a spectacle. They say, hey, we're not lynching people out here. It's not racist. There's no tension here. But it was all kind of a lie because when we get into the 1920s to 1921, when we get right into the massacre, we have our newer city government. We've got James N. Atkinson, John A. Gustafson, and Thaddeus D. Evans, who was the mayor at the time. These men are kind of like the last nail in the coffin. They are the ones who make sure that if you're going to hate somebody, if you want somebody to hate, it's going to be black people now, because now we've moved up to where we need to be for the massacre. So what happens is Thaddeus D. Evans is the mayor. Before he was the mayor, he was what they call the police judge for the City Council of Defense, which means that if you needed to find somebody guilty, if you needed to get somebody out of your way, you take them to Evans Court because Evans will do what those guys say. They all know each other, and then now suddenly he's the mayor. So now we get to the massacre. Of course, we know what happened. Well, we now know what happened in the massacre. It starts with them wanting to lynch a young man named Dick Rowland because he happened to bump into a white woman named Sarah Page. And a lot of people try to play their relationship off as the reason, but it's honestly irrelevant because that's not what this is about. It's about the city trying to perpetrate a massacre and then literally perpetrating a massacre to get rid of the black people in their side of town and destroy their generational wealth. We even have evidence here. We have this looping 1-minute photo of some of the aftermath, some of the city still burning, people looking through the streets and being quarantined in a baseball field because they're not allowed to leave. And it's all perpetrated by these men. And so you would think, well, how does something like this happen? Well, it happened because right after the actual burning of the city, we have something that they kind of implement called the culture of silence. And the culture of silence is basically, let's squash all information about this. Because in 1921, we still have radios and stuff. Other cities around the country, Chicago, San Francisco, New York, they hear about this and they're pouring out money. They're like, hey, Tulsa, we hear what happened. This happened in Chicago a while ago, which also had to do with some union problems because black men want to be treated right at work. They're like, well, let's help rebuild your city. Well, instead of taking all that money, rebuilding the city back to its former glory, T.D. Evans is like, oh no, we got it. You don't need to give us any money. So he spreads, if I remember correctly, about $200,000 throughout Greenwood to repair the city, and then tells everybody else that we don't need their money. But what he actually does with that money is he kind of reshapes the landscape, and he helps implement the ordinances about housing, where you can't build your house in these burnt down places anymore because of the fire. You have to build it out of brick and mortar now. It's 1921. Brick and mortar is very expensive. So now people can't go home. They're stuck in a baseball field downtown where they're treated just like, several years later, the Jewish people will be treated in Europe. They have to wear white tags that say police protection on them. And those tags signify that a white person knows them and that they're allowed to leave the baseball field to go home. The National Guard and the Red Cross were supposed to be there for 2 months to help get these people back on the field and their feet. And they ended up staying there for 6+ months, all throughout the winter, trying to take care of these people who lost their homes and their property. Eventually, the famous lawyer and his son and the people who work for him, B.C. Franklin, his son John Hope Franklin is who we have a street here named after and a center named after as well. They eventually overturned, that ordinance, but the damage was already done at that point. They had gotten rid of all the newspapers in the city that detailed that the massacre had happened. They called it a riot. They then printed newspapers about how it was all the black side of town's fault. They were unruly. It was their fault. They did this. And that's how we get to where we're at today. You know, Greenwood's basically just a strip of street. You know, there's a highway going through. The school that I go to, ironically, is right smack dab in the middle of where people used to live. You know, 'cause that's how much the city didn't care about these people. And so that's how you get to where we're at now. You know, Greenwood's fighting to get some of the land back to, you know, keep what they've got even. And we're trying to make sure that everybody knows why they're doing that, because that it's important to know why that kind of stuff's happening.
Thank you so much, Mr. Johnny Irons, our latest and greatest co-conspirator at the Center for Public Secrets. This is Chief Amushan signing off for the Center for Public Secrets. The battle is still in progress. Thank you.